Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Farami Red Honey Processed Costa Rica from Wes Ngopi. There's the bag right there. And Wes Ngopi, based out of Shah, Malaysia. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel quite a bit over the last few months, and a coffee roaster that will continue to appear on this channel quite a bit over the next few months. And that's largely due to the fact that they continue to release coffees that do catch my interest. That being said, of the Wes Ngopi reviews that we do have coming up, this is probably the coffee I was least excited to discuss, as I essentially picked this one up to get us to the point of free shipping. Even then, we don't review too many Costa Rican coffees throughout the year, and even fewer Costa Rican geishas, so it should still make for an interesting review, as this coffee right here is day 54. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So we have discussed Wes Ngopi's roast profile quite a bit in some of our previous reviews of their coffees, as once upon a time they were on the extremely light side of things, but more recently we've noticed that their coffees are, I would say, still light, but on the more moderately light side of things, as they're not quite as light as some other Asian coffee roasters we've reviewed like Mood Trap or Guten Co, but even then they are still lighter than the majority of other Asian coffee roasters that we do review, so that's why we align them with being on the more moderately light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 28, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the aroma of the coffee itself was notably fermenty, but interestingly enough, it wasn't translating into the cup, as it did offer a cleaner representation of a Costa Rican coffee with a mostly citric forward tea feel to it. In addition to that, there was a slight bit of some tart berries to contrast that citric component, so it wasn't quite what we were expecting for a Costa Rican coffee, as oftentimes they can skew a bit too much on the red berry side of things. But this one didn't necessarily have that, so it did have a better than expected first impression. Day 31 through the Chemex, and the coffee is cleaner again, with a mostly citric forward feel to it yet again, though the coffee was notably more tame with a more tea forward feel this time around. Moderate intensity overall, so this was just an okay day, as I was wondering if this coffee was maybe just going to be a bit more delicate overall. Day 34 through the April brewer, and the coffee is the best it had been to this point, as it's opening up more in terms of the intensity, as there's a slight bit more of a floral honey feel to this one, with a darker citric quality to it as well, but also a bit more of the berry fermentiness, which is the aroma I was picking up in this coffee pretty early on, as that's something that I do tend to pick up from a lot of more processed Costa Rican coffees. And even though this one is a geisha, not necessarily that processed, with it just being a red honey processed coffee, it still had a bit of that was hindering the overall experience of this coffee and taking away from the clarity in general. Day 37 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and the coffee has grown in intensity, but it is skewing a bit more on the Costa Rican side of things, with a prominent red berry aspect in a slightly fermenty sense. And that's much more what I was expecting from this coffee going into it, given that Costa Rican coffees oftentimes are a bit more on the red berry side of things than I would necessarily like, though this coffee didn't have any notes like that would indicate that that's the direction that this one was going to go. But even then, it was certainly something that I did pick up within this coffee quite often, as the citric and honey tones did continue to remain ever present within this one. Day 40 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee is still slightly marred by that slight bit of fermentiness, as it's intense otherwise. In addition to that, there's a bit more of the honey and savory aspects, as the Earl Grey note is quite apt. It's one of the more savory qualities that I was picking up from this coffee, though it does still present a bit more of a Costa Rican red berry profile to it at the base of it. Day 43 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it is better today, as it is offering a bit of the listed peachiness this time around, and this is the first time I'd experienced that peachiness. And going into it, what really sold me on making this coffee the final coffee that we picked up from Wes Ngopi was the fact that they did have that peach note listed on there. And I said, this is a geisha coffee, it's got peach on there, so hopefully that's going to be the most prominent aspect presented in a cleaner sense. And this was finally the first time I'd experienced it, as it was otherwise pretty honey and red forward once again. Cleaner today, as it's presented in a bit more subtle of a sense, with the intensity being a bit more present within a lingering finish to this one. Day 46 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was by far the best the coffee had been to this point, and it's going to be kind of interesting when we discuss these Wes Ngopi coffees, as I feel like they really seem to open up around this day 45 plus mark, as some of the experiences we had up to this point were, I would say, fair to okay, and then at this moment the coffee really just seemed to drastically improve from earlier on, as it finally is offering plenty of delisted stone fruit aspects with a very prominent white peach component to it. And as I mentioned, that's what I was looking for within this coffee, so finally experiencing it in abundance today definitely helped the overall experience of it, as it's also much sweeter in general with a better defined honey and citric quality as well, vastly improved. We move on to day 49 as we opted for the Chemex, once again with very similar results, as it has a very nice mix of peach, lemon, and the earlier Costa Rican-like red berry aspect, all presented in a subtle but sweeter sense nonetheless, mostly tea-like in terms of the body and the presentation, with plenty of softer honey and lighter colored florals as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's start with the cleanliness level 4. And right from the first time I brewed this coffee, I was wondering if it was going to be hindered by the fermentiness that I was picking up from the aroma, but I was very happy to find that that wasn't an ever-present within this coffee, as it's something that you can work through and maybe dilute, tone down within this coffee. So by the end, especially given that there was some very nice definition to the stone fruit qualities, level 4 certainly felt justified in this one. Finish, level 4. And I mentioned that a lot of the intensity was presented within the finish itself, as it was a bit more on that floral side of things, which is something we'll get into as well with the sweetness, as that honeyed aspect was an ever-present quality to this coffee that at times can be a little bit more subtle and tame. So having that be what's most pronounced within this coffee is that slightly more intense finish to it that did seem to give it a little bit more depth in that regard. Sweetness, level 4, and given that this coffee was so subtle for the majority of the time, I think that the sweetness was allowing itself to present itself in a bit more prominent of a manner than it would have otherwise, as there was a little bit more of that honey-like sweetness to it, as the fruits didn't necessarily always present themselves in an overly sweet sense. The citric quality as well as the berry quality weren't particularly sweet. Granted, the sugariness of the stone fruits did seem to help, but for the most part, it was that honey-like aspect that did seem to give it a bit more of a sweetness. Florality, level 4, discussed that quite a bit, as there are some white florals to it, but I would have to say that it's mostly a floral honey aspect that does give it a very high scoring level 4, as it is probably one of the most consistent qualities within this coffee, right there with the citric quality, which is also at a level 4, a bit more of that lemon-like feel to it, kind of giving it a lot of those tea-like attributes. So those two things, the most consistent notes. Berry fruit also there at the level 4, and it is kind of fun to go through these fruit qualities within this coffee, because I experienced a lot more of those from day 3, the third time we brewed them, onwards, as it wasn't necessarily abundant within the first couple of days, but from that point going forward, it was always going to be at the level 4 mark. Same thing with the citrus, first time we brewed it all the way through the end, it was at that level 4 mark. And then the final fruit quality, which is that stone fruit, also scoring there at the level 4. And that one, on the other hand, I didn't experience it at the level 4 until the second last time we brewed it. Up to that point, I could say maybe the third last brew that we had of this coffee would score a level 3. But outside of that, it wasn't really prominent in any regard, as level 2 would be the highest I could score it any day before that. So it really did seem to shoot up in that day 45 plus mark. One level 3. Actually, a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Not necessarily the brightest coffee, and that's going to be a bit of a trend with the Wes Ngopi coffees that we are discussing, as it's there, but I would say that it's nothing that's overly notable within this coffee, which can be a bit of a sticking point for some people. I was fine, given that this coffee was pretty subtle to begin with. And then the two things we're discussing left, the savoriness level 3. As mentioned, there's a lot of that Earl Grey quality, which is entirely what that level 3 does indicate, as that became pretty pronounced, I would say a bit more towards the end, but even then it wasn't ever present within this coffee. And then final thing we're discussing, body level 2. And it could be a combination of factors, one being that we did brew this one with the Chemex, and the other being that it is a Gesha. Even then, not necessarily the most amount of body or texture to this one, so it did score a little lower in that sense. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Of the 5 Wes Ngopi coffees that we did pick up from this purchase specifically, unsurprisingly, this one was my least favorite of those 5, but it's also the one I had the lowest expectations for and the one that was least in line with my own preferences. So that's not really surprising in any regard. I do have some positives to still say about this coffee, given that it is a Costa Rican coffee, and there are very few Costa Rican coffees that I do enjoy. So I think that this one did better than the average Costa Rican coffee for me. And even though this one is, I suppose, technically a higher end Costa Rican coffee, it's still pretty common for me to be a little let down by a lot of the more high end Costa Rican coffees, as there are a number of quechas I've had from Costa Rica that I also haven't particularly enjoyed. So credits to the producers on this one, as I feel like they did a very good job of presenting this coffee in a slightly more processed sense without giving it too much of a heaviness in terms of that very strong red berry aspect that I do usually pick up from Costa Rican coffees. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like you really have to like your much more honeyed aspects of this one, because this one was just so prominent and present within that regard. In addition to that, that contrasting kind of savoriness that came from that Earl Grey and a lot of those citric qualities to it. Those are 3 things that I could give or take. Not necessarily my favorite things in coffee to begin with, but it is nicely balanced by some really enjoyable sweetness and some additional fruit qualities to it. So keep in mind that it does still present itself in a very Costa Rican-like way. At the same time, you are rewarded with a lot of those sweeter peach qualities if you do enjoy that, as that was the best part of this coffee for me. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Farami Red Honey Processed Costa Rica from Wes Ngopi. Thank you for watching.